When a review is required, normally your DSEAR assessment will be split into what we define as unit operations, things like material loading and storage, or material transfer operations, or mixing and blending and grinding and so on, all of which can change. You know, performance systems of the ventilation systems installed, the extraction systems installed may not be the same as they were when they were first put in. The materials that were handled may not be the same. And this is really important when we talk about combustible dust, where we know, if you've listened to some of our previous seminars where we talk ad nauseum about particle size distribution being important for the generation of combustible dust clouds. Yeah. So with a standard solvent, say toluene or acetone, we know things don't really change. We can have a different supplier of toluene, and really it doesn't make any difference to the risk assessment. But if we change our supplier of a powdered product and it turns out to be having a larger dusty component, you know, it's being ground more, or part of your processing operations, you're grinding the material finer for a particular product or whatever, then of course the precautions that you've got built in may now not be suitable, or may need upgrading to deal with this increased particles, with this lower particle size, okay, and things like that. So lots of things can change, and we need to be able to get at those changes and assess them properly to make sure that the systems we're employing, the methods of preventing ignition sources, the methods of controlling flammable atmospheres, the measures for ensuring that the venting is sized appropriately and so on, may need to change if we go for different suppliers of existing materials. So when there's a change, so when we introduce a new process, material, or equipment, if the equipment's starting to get old, nothing wrong with old things generally. There's nothing wrong with old people like me. But generally, as things get old, we need to look after them better. I rattle a bit more now than I did 10 years ago because I have to take certain pills every morning. Okay, and that's a fact of life with older people. It's equally a fact of life with older equipment. You know, we may not be able to get exactly the same seals that are on that piece of equipment that we used to get because it's now getting on in years. Changes to an existing process. So as I say, you know, running the batch time longer. You're being very successful. So instead of 1 batch a day, you're now doing 10 batches a day. Yeah, nothing's changed from the hazard point of view, but your zoning may have changed now, where before you could say that it was a zone 21 or a zone 1, it may now, because of the frequency of operation, it may actually be a zone 20 or a zone 0. Okay, the way we do things might be different. We may have started, you know, adding flammable liquids below the surface of water, and that controls flashpoint really. But you know, we may change, and we may standard operating procedures may change and say, well, we add the flammable liquid into the pot first, and then we put the water on. So things like this may change. Your ventilation characteristics in your rooms or in your buildings or around the facility may change because they become more congested, or the performance falls off. Changes in your storage conditions, changes in conveyance methods. So you're still just transferring from one process to another, but you're doing it in a different way. So the risks will change, whether you're using pneumatic conveying or whether you're using screw conveyors or bucket elevators. If we change these sorts of things, then the risk assessment will change. It should prompt us to carry out this review. So when we make a change, we're looking for the impact on the extent of a hazardous area, how big that hazardous area is. For example, if we move from filling from 25 kilo bags in and then using flexible IBCs, the extent of our hazardous areas is likely to increase, because a spillage from a 25 kilo bag, we may have determined the hazardous extent is 1 metre, but if we drop a flexible IBC and cause a spillage that way, common sense hopefully sort of indicates that we'll have more than 1 metre now, and the dust may go up to 3 metres, for example. The zonal classification, as I've said, looking at the probability or the frequency with which we do these operations, the frequency with which that flammable atmosphere is present, and the type of equipment protection that we've got. So very typically we find that ATEX equipment may be installed and it's certified for vapors, for flammable vapors, but then we make a change and start adding some combustible solids, combustible powders into the mix, but the material isn't certified for combustible dust. It's only certified for combustible vapors. Okay, and again, these things may prompt us to, on our dust collection systems or our vapor recovery systems, to our protection systems may need to change. The area of vent relief, for example. The suppression equipment will have been set up specifically against one material, and the distance between where the suppression equipment is installed and where the detector is installed to pick up that explosion may change if we use different types of material. So, overall, our total basis of safety, all this, everything around avoidance of flammable atmospheres, avoidance of ignition sources, protecting ourselves against an ignited event, may be compromised and thus no longer valid, because we've made what on the face of it is a very minor change. We've taken out, we now get our flour, our dusty flour from one manufacturer rather from another one, or we change from a wheat-based flour to a rye-based flour, and these sorts of things can all have an impact because the particle size distribution may change. Things like the minimum ignition energy for that powder may be different. Wheat flour, for example, could be greater than 1,000 millijoules minimum ignition energy. Rye flour can be down at 50 millijoules. Okay, so we would need increased controls around electrostatic hazards if we simply make the change from wheat flour to rye flour, for example. And of course, we can have new effective ignition sources. So, we need to consider, as you say in the standard, there's 13 types of potential ignition sources. But the main ones in the processing industry are hot surfaces, mechanical sparking. So if we change the seals, if we change the clearances, if we change the materials of construction, that can all have an impact on mechanical sparking. Our electrostatic discharges, and the presence of unsuitable electricals, so uncertified equipment present when it should be certified within our hazardous zones.